Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the third and final session of our global webinar series 2023 on the topic Strategic Environmental Assessments and Planning Tools for Sustainable Oceans Planning. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are and across the different time zones. I see that we're already nearly at 170 people on the platform, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Sadhika Shashi Prabhu, and I work with the United Nations Environment Program in the Disasters and Conflicts branch, based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm a legal analyst under the partnership between UNEP and the government of Norway, which works to promote and strengthen national institutional capacities to reduce environmental pollution risks in the energy sector. Previously, with a focus on the oil and gas sector, our work now increasingly looks at the environmental implications of renewable energy, particularly offshore energy in the marine environment. Our work involves delivering technical assistance and training to countries, as well as undertaking global outreach activities that address social, environmental, and governance safeguards in the energy sector. Our annual global webinar series aims to spread awareness and encourages multi-stakeholder dialogues about the latest developments in the energy sector. This year, we chose to focus on sustainable oceans governance and energy considerations to better understand how to navigate the intersection of offshore energy with other development sectors like shipping, fishing, while also simultaneously balancing environmental commitments. Webinar 1 was a spotlight on major global agreements and legal and policy developments in the marine and energy space, while Webinar 2 explored the potential pollution and environmental risks associated with the upcoming renewable offshore energy and efforts to avoid these risks. As oceans get busier, global competition for resources heightens, spatial tensions across marine spaces will intensify. To conclude this series, our third session today will analyze how environmental assessment and planning instruments can contribute towards multi-sectoral sustainable ocean governance while mitigating environmental threats. Before we start, I just wanted to go over some logistics. This is a reminder that this is a recorded webinar and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. We encourage audience participation and ask you to send all your questions into the questions box. We will try to answer as many of them during the question and answer session. So please feel free to type in. Unfortunately, we will not be able to give you the floor to speak given the limited time we have, but please send in your questions. You will receive a certificate of participation if you stay with us until the end and fill out the webinar feedback form. Please also find the PowerPoint and the bios of our speakers uploaded in the handout section. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jasmine Zig-Ikora, our session moderator. Jasmine is the Senior Advisor of Learning, Development and Outreach at the Association for the Prevention of Torture, which coordinates and implements capacity building and outreach programs. She's worked with various UN agencies, including United Nations Environment Program, UNITAR, in the development, coordination, and implementation of various capacity building activities related to international law, human rights, energy, and environmental law. She has legal experience working in human rights in the energy sector, providing legal support to nonprofit organizations and government institutions in various regions, including Africa, North America, Asia, and the Middle East. We're so glad to have you on board, Jasmine. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Sadika. It's nice to see you. Nice to see everyone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on whereabouts in the world you're calling in from. So I'll be moderating this session, and just to point out that we'll be exploring environmental assessment and planning tools to understand how they support sustainable ocean planning. So basically in the webinar, we'll discuss SEAs and how they inform marine spatial planning and supplement environmental impact assessment processes, and consider how they would be used to utilize the offshore energy sector. So before we start off, I would like to introduce Letitia. She would be setting the scene for this webinar, and she'll be providing us with an overview of how marine spatial planning relates to global policy frameworks. So Letitia is the principal coordinator of the Marine and Freshwater Branch of UNEP. She's also an international civil servant and policymaker with 20 years of experience in environmental governance and sustainable development multilateral negotiations. So at UNEP, she has led the historical action against plastic pollution. She's helped mainstream ocean and freshwater ecosystem-based management into the relevant global and regional MEAs and spearheaded ocean literacy and advocacy. Letitia, you're welcome. You have the floor.
Thanks, many thanks, Jasmine, for the welcome and warm welcome in this meeting, in this webinar. Colleagues, partners, esteemed participants, it is a great pleasure that I open the webinar 3 of the series for a pivotal discussion on environmental assessment and planning tools, a cornerstone for inclusive and sustainable ocean governance and management. As we convene today, let us reflect on the delicate balance we must strike amidst the increasing pressures facing marine environment. The ocean is a shared resource, a dynamic arena with a myriad of users and stakeholders. Yet the expanding population and the growing demands for raw materials, water, food, and access often leads to conflicting ocean activities. This underscores the critical need for strategic solutions and integrated planning. It's a human challenge. We used this space, we made ourselves available there. So we have to take on the responsibility to take care of the ocean. In the vast expanse of the interconnected ocean, we find a call to action, a shared global responsibility to coordinate and cooperate in the governance and management of our blue ecosystems. Nothing short of all hands on deck is going to be needed. The interdependence of the ocean demands a collective effort to foster ocean governance grounded in a shared vision. It is through such a shared vision that we unlock the potential for cooperation, paving the way for sustainable solutions to the challenge we face. I would like to give 2 very strong examples of policy and leadership: the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the UN Ocean Decade on Science for Sustainable Development create the conditions for a revolution in the way we generate and use the ocean science to inform marine planning, decision-making, and solutions that will contribute to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UNEP will bring the tools. Governments will need to bring the political will. Let's work together and lean into the opportunities these decades provide. Crucial to this journey are the planning tools at our disposal, such as strategic environmental assessments and marine spatial planning. These tools are not mere mechanisms, but the architects, the foundational elements of strengthened communication networks, shared data resources, and coordinated management efforts. A noteworthy aspect of the strategic environment assessments is their ecosystem-centric approach, harmonizing environmental, economic, and social considerations to balance human development with ecological limits. So too, the rising adoption of marine spatial planning with around 100 countries, we still have 90 something to go, and territories establishing initiatives, it speaks to the growing recognition of this transformative potential. So we know action is coming, progress is being done, and still a lot is ahead of us. Today, we delve into the practical applications of these planning and assessment tools, exploring how they can assist countries in creating or crafting sustainable blue economies. Their overarching role in promoting coexistence in the marine domain, especially in transboundary regions, is of paramount importance, acknowledging the diverse needs and activities unfolding in the ocean. However, as we navigate these waters, it is crucial to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-for-all approach or no silver bullet. The diversity of challenges calls for a nuanced understanding of how to achieve greater cross-sectoral cooperation in our marine and coastal environments. Today's discussions offer an invaluable opportunity to unravel the complexities and discover innovative solutions to address these challenges head-on. By learning from country-level experiences, we seek to unearth lessons that can guide us toward more effective collaborative solutions. As we engage today's conversations, we anticipate valuable insights that will not only inform our understanding, but also contribute to the broader global discussions, particularly in the context of the recently adopted Global Biodiversity Framework. 30 by 30 is a target for marine and all freshwater-related ecosystems, giving to this community in this particular webinar a great responsibility. Together, let us pave the way for a sustainable blue future, where our shared responsibility for our ocean guides us towards collective prosperity and environmental stewardship. Friends, I look forward to an enriching exchange of ideas and experiences. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jasmine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Letitia. This is it's important, and I noticed that you pointed out that there's no one size fits all, and this is what we'll be seeing throughout this webinar. We have a very good mix of panelists from the private and public sector, so this is what we'll be looking forward to seeing their listening to their experiences and the challenges that they've faced. So with no much further ado, I would like to invite the first panelist, Aaron Koloff. Aaron works as a senior technical secretary at the International Department of the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment. He has a degree in human geography from Utrecht University, and the title of his PhD thesis was Towards Better Performing EIA Systems in Low and Middle Income Countries. He has over 30 years of experience as trainer and advisor on EIA and SEA capacity development in over 30 countries. And he also has a special interest in integrating climate change and biodiversity in impact assessments in low and middle income countries. So welcome, Aaron. Aaron will be giving us an overview of SEAs. Like we may know, SEAs are a very important tool in for the integration of environmental considerations into preparation for plans and programs. So Aaron will be giving us an overview of SEAs. He would use a case study to further elaborate on this issue, and he would highlight the differences between SEAs, EIAs, and who actually leads these processes. So welcome on board, Aaron, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, participants, for joining. It's my pleasure to share some of my experience in the field of strategic environmental assessment, and today we will focus on the basics of SEA. So in this talk, I will try to answer questions. What is strategic environmental assessment? Why doing strategic environmental assessment? And finally, what are the benefits of strategic environmental assessment? So the formal definition of strategic environmental assessment, which is widely agreed upon by the SEA community, is SEA is a tool to support and improve strategic planning and decision making. SEA complements strategic planning by integrating environmental issues, evaluating their interlinkages with economic and social issues, and facilitating a public and governmental dialogue on these issues. So it is focusing on environmental issues, but definitely economic and increasingly social issues are incorporated as well. The take-home message is, keep that in mind, SEA is increasingly acknowledged as the tool to integrate environmental issues, including climate change and biodiversity, in government plans. Probably most of you are familiar with what is known as environmental impact assessment or environmental and social impact assessment. That is a decision support tool supporting projects mainly from the private sector. And that is done all over the world in all countries because it's a legal obligation. Strategic environmental assessment is a much younger tool. And typically, strategic environmental assessment is complementary to ESIA, as it supports government policies, plans, and programs in taking better decisions from the environmental perspective. Typically, questions like why, what, and where are answered, and I will give you an example of that. This is a picture of one of the first wind farms that were developed in the marine area of the Netherlands, because I will provide an example to you from the Netherlands, where I'm living and where our organization is based. This wind farm became operational a little bit more than 10 years ago already, and it was a first demonstration pilot area. And it was subject to EIA because it required an environmental permit. But because of the energy transition, we as a country, we decided we need much more wind farms in the marine area of our country. So the question, of course, then is where to put them. So we started an SEA about 10 years ago, and this SEA was supporting the selection of the most suitable sites to develop offshore wind energy. And I just informed you that SEA is supporting government plans. And in this case, the SEA was supporting the development of the integrated maritime spatial policy in the Netherlands. So on the left side, you see the output of a one-year process resulting in this three-colored map. And what does this picture show you? It is the marine area of the Netherlands, the 200 miles zone. In the yellow lights, you see the country of the Netherlands, a small country in the northwestern part of Europe. And those three colors, they are very important in the result of this assessment process. In green, it was considered that those areas are very suitable for wind farms for a variety of reasons. Orange, there are risks related to those areas, and red are the areas where we do not prefer to set up wind farms for all kinds of reasons. I will just inform you a little bit later about which reasons and why. So you will see that the output of this SEA process feed into the marine spatial policy, and that was the development of an integrated planning process. And if you zoom in a little bit within the black circle in the middle on the three-color SEA map, you will see that there are a number of so-called shipping lanes, and typically those shipping lanes are, for obvious reasons, not suitable for wind farms. You'll also see that on the right side, for example, in the top of the right side, you see a very green area that is a protected area. So protected areas for biodiversity reasons are also excluded from being suitable for wind farm. So fisheries, of course, is a very important other aspect that was taken into consideration, as well as tourism, because you will see on the three-color map that the first 12 miles zone bordering the coast of the Netherlands is in red, because about 10-12 years ago we thought that tourists on the beach didn't want to look into a wind farm, so we excluded the first 12 miles from being suitable for setting up wind farms. And then, of course, a very important aspect, it's an economic aspect, is the costs for cabling, because all those wind farms need to be connected to the power net on land. And that is a very costly investment. And that, of course, is an important factor as well. So what you see is on the left side, the green and the orange areas in principle are suitable for wind energy. And then on the right picture, you will see in pink in the middle circle, the areas that finally have been selected. And those are, I think, in total 4 or 5 pink areas where we are now constructing large wind farms in the marine part of our marine area in the Netherlands. On the next picture, you will see that we also closely work together with our neighboring countries. This is an example where we work together with Germany, also to save costs on cabling. So we develop our own wind farm, but Germany also develops their wind farm, and we make use of one cable to save costs. And the same we do with our neighbor in the south, Belgium. So if we compare ESIA and SEA, and just I will pick out some of the criteria. In ESIA, we focus on mitigation, try to minimize the negative environmental effects. And with SEA, as I've just shown you, we try to avoid those areas which are less suitable for wind farms. So we try to avoid negative impacts. Concerning participation in ESIA, often the general public is engaged. In SEA, we are usually dealing with much larger areas, and not all participants can be engaged in the process. So the focus is more on in the ministerial and representative bodies who are engaged in that process. And then thirdly, in ESIA, there is more a focus on project options, while in SEA, there is stronger focus on strategic alternatives, and in general, more qualitative data are used, while in ESIA, more primary data gathering is searched for and analyzed. This is a picture that shows that SEA is becoming more and more important as a legal tool. So in the 70s, I think the United States was one of the first countries adopting SEA as a legal tool. And you will see that over the last, especially the last 20 years, a large number of countries have adopted SEA. We keep record of the development of SEA legislation around the world, and we are presently working on an update. So in yellow, you see that most of the other countries are already applying SEA, but they have no legislation yet. So you might conclude that SEA is adopted by many countries, about 106 in 2019 out of the 194 countries legally adopted SEA. And many of the other countries are working on legislation, and only about 60-65 countries have no legislation yet. SEA is also internationally acknowledged and recognized. The European Union adopted the SEA directive in 2003. The United Nations adopted the SEA protocol in 2004. And I think a very important recent development in September this year or August this year, the Treaty on the High Seas was adopted by the UN. And in this treaty, SEA and EAA are recognized and acknowledged as very important tools to steer the development of economic activities, amongst others like deep sea mining in the high seas. So the next question.
Sorry, Aaron, just to let you know, you have 5 minutes left for your presentation.
Right, thank you. Why SEA? Well, that is an easy question, because we only have one planet, and that is the resource base for our development. But this is a picture prepared by the Stockholm Resilience Institutes, which I often use because all countries have assigned to achieve the SDGs in 2030. And this picture shows that we call them the green or the blue SDGs. They are the foundation, and they can be considered as a condition for being able to achieve the other SDGs. So it very strongly shows the importance of those green and blue SDGs. And through SEA, we can show through, by making use of integrating environmental issues in policies and plans for the other SDGs, how those can be achieved. So then finally, the benefits of SEA. Well, in yellow, the typical benefits which are very much appreciated by the private sector, because SEA will result in cheaper, faster, and more effective EAAs, and it will facilitate a level playing field. But it also will build to commitment and trust, preventing conflicts. It will contribute to supporting evidence-based decision-making, improve the quality of the plans and programs, identify more sustainable alternatives, prevent costly mistakes, and contribute to the development of green jobs and green investment, strengthen governance, because it's a participatory process. And finally, as I already mentioned, it supports to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. All those benefits and all those claims are justified by good practice SEAs, which are applied by a growing number of countries. So finally, the key messages: SEA is a legal tool and it's becoming more and more important. SEA is the tool to integrate environmental issues in government plans. Thirdly, SEA supports the debate on alternative, more sustainable development pathways. And finally, SEA supports integrated planning by facilitating interministerial cooperation, because the marine plan that benefited from the SEA in the Netherlands was an interministerial cooperation effort. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It was very interesting to see how in the Netherlands you use the SEAs to identify areas that were suitable for the for putting up wind farms. So we have a question based on this. Just to remind people participating that you can put in your questions. In case you have any questions, put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer as much as we can within this hour. So can we say that that ESIA is generally preceded before by SEAs in countries that have SEA legislations?
Yes, in good practice, that is the chain of doing policies, plans, and programs. SEA at policy level can support more strategic decisions on where to develop those wind farms, and once those areas have been selected, an EAA, of course, is necessary to finally support the operation, construction, and operation of a wind farm at a specific site. So that is indeed the sequence of activities.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It was really great to hear all this. So moving on, I would like to introduce Gonzalo Carneiro. He is sorry, hold 1 second. He is a senior analyst at the Unit for Marine Spatial Planning at the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. He works primarily with the Swedish National Marine Spatial Planning, with particular focus on strategic environmental assessments, fisheries, and shipping issues. So Gonzalo will be discussing the role of marine spatial planning for sustainable ocean governance. He will focus primarily on the development of offshore renewable energy. He would use, drawing from his experience from Sweden, he would use examples from also other places to reflect on the specific contribution of marine spatial planning for balancing competing uses of the ocean in view of satisfying different societal needs and objectives. So welcome, Gonzalo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. May I ask you to confirm that you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who is attending. I will give you a quick run through of marine spatial planning as a process, or you can call it a tool, as among others, for ocean governance, for sustainable ocean governance. And I'll take a particular look into how offshore energy, in particular offshore renewable energy, has been shaping the practice of marine spatial planning. And I'll start by putting up the 3 main points I would like you to, or I'd like to share with you. The first is that marine spatial planning can be an important process for society to determine suitable spaces and conditions for human users at sea, including offshore energy. That the assessment of suitability, in this, with focus on offshore energy, but also on other uses, needs to take into consideration impacts on environment and other uses. And this is to a large extent where SEA that Aaron just presented to us comes in. And then a third point, and I'll come to this towards the end, is that the role of marine spatial planning relative to other government instruments shapes its ability to contribute to sustainable ocean use. This to say that marine spatial planning is not a silver bullet that will solve all marine management issues that countries have. So in a very small nutshell, what is marine spatial planning? And it's basically a process for societies or society to determine the spatial and temporal distribution of human interests at sea. So it's, in its simplest definition, it's nothing more than land use planning at sea. You basically try to design and assign space and define the conditions for the use of that space according to a number of criteria. It usually proceeds through a sequence of steps, and I need to just recall that IUC UNESCO and others have published over the years a number of guides, guidance on how to conduct MSP. That is very useful. It's much more detailed than what I'll present to you here. So please refer to those if you want to delve more into the details. But let's say that it starts with a political decision about goals and priorities. And these goals and priorities pertain both to what societies want to do with their marine spaces, and also the goals and priorities of the marine spatial planning process itself. So what should it achieve? How should it proceed? Who should be involved? What principles should it follow? Once you set these, and these are usually set in a policy or a legislation in the countries that are more advanced on marine spatial planning, then you do the technical work. I call it a technical scientific process for distributing interests at sea. This can be very diverse the way it is done. I call it scientific because in all cases I know of, there's an attempt to use the best available scientific information and produce more information where that is absent. This usually ends in or results in a plan proposal that is submitted for review by stakeholders. Again, how this consultation is conducted varies widely between countries. It has more to do with the public participation tradition and laws and regulations in the countries than with the marine spatial planning process itself. But it's a very important element, and I should maybe say here that marine spatial planning has over the years been put forward as the most important tool to ensure that everyone has a say on how the ocean is used, and that has in fact been the case in many countries, given maybe the failure or the limitation of other policy processes to achieve just that. Anyway, and as a final step would be the adoption of an executive instrument with usually a plan. It might be a law, depends again on the laws of the different countries. But anyway, an executive or an administrative instrument with provisions regarding zoning. So where should things take place? And eventually, in some jurisdictions, you also do have management actions linked to the plan. So you not only say activity A may take place in a certain location, but you also say how that activity will need to be managed. And this is just an example from Sweden. So this is part of one of our marine plans, and it's with slight variations. Most marine plans looks something like this in regards to their zoning component. So you have a piece of your marine area, and you assign different users. In this particular image, you have these large chunks of sea area in either this orange or this striped pattern that are areas for offshore wind. Then you have these blue corridors that are assigned for shipping. You have the dots, who are areas preferential for fishing. And you have this large darker area in the bottom, and that's an area for recreational users. And you see that some of these users are compatible and can take place on the same spot. Others are exclusive, like shipping and offshore wind, for example. So you don't see those two things superimposed. Actually, you do in one small site there, but there's a story behind that I won't go into. Now, turning a bit to offshore energy, and again, here our work, at least in Sweden, and I would say that in most countries right now, it mostly pertains to renewable offshore energy, but there are obviously countries also planning for fossil energy forms, and those are equally pertinent in terms of or also need to be taken in consideration in marine spatial planning. I'll start off by saying that offshore renewable energy development has been a key driver in marine spatial planning in several parts of the world, and that pertains both to the development of new plans and not least to the review of existing plans. And that is very much the case in Northern Europe, where plans are being reviewed repeatedly because of new developments in terms of offshore renewable energy. And the steps that are usually involved in planning for offshore renewable energy, they are, I would say, they're very similar to the steps for planning for any other use. You start by mapping suitable areas, considering the sector preferences in terms of the natural conditions, let's say depth, wind, proximity to coast, but also economy. We heard, for example, Arendt mentioned the cost of cabling. So you want to be relatively close to shore to cut down on those costs. You want to be, and that's an issue we have in Sweden, but I guess in other countries as well, you want to be building your offshore wind power plants in areas where there is consumption, so that you have a market or an easier market where to sell your energy to. So you start by mapping that, we could call this as sectoral mapping, basically. Then you assess as part of the marine planning process, you assess the compatibility with existing and future users. One of these users or interests, let's call it like that, is nature conservation, biodiversity conservation. So that needs to be taken into account as well. Once you identify once you cook this into a set of areas and you define the conditions for offshore wind to operate in those areas. And then you incorporate these areas into your marine spatial plan. Strategic environmental assessment that Arendt told us about usually comes in at the time of assessing compatibility with nature and other users. I won't go much more into that because we've already heard from Arendt. And it's an essential step and has been in most geographies in determining how a marine spatial plan should look like. And then one issue that frequently comes up is the input by offshore wind developers or offshore energy developers, and how reliant marine spatial planning processes are on that input. I would say from the Swedish experience, and I'll come to the map in shortly. I would say that we have, well, let's put it like this. I would probably say that offshore wind developers know more of suitable areas than do planners. Planners take into consideration a whole bunch of other things that are relevant for society. but I would say that offshore wind developers probably have a better grip on where it is most suitable to build. So it is valuable input. It should not be determining input into the areas chosen for offshore wind, but it should not be ignored either. The image to the right shows you in green the areas on the Swedish west coast where there are offshore wind projects, so projects by private developers, and in this orange rosa color, the proposed areas, these are not accepted yet, these are under consultation, that might be inscribed in the Marine Spatial Plan. And you'll see that they superimpose to some extent, but not fully. So there's a different set of parameters and considerations that go into the planning process relative to how the private developers have reasoned on these areas. And I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged.
Sorry, Gonzalo, just to let you know,
yes.
you have like roughly 5 minutes to wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That will be more than enough. And then my final points, some important aspects to consider. The first one is it's important when engaging or when starting a marine spatial planning process. It's important to consider and to define clearly what is its role relative to other instruments for marine governance. What is the specific role that Marine Spatial Plan will fulfill? What is the governance gap that it will fill? And what we have seen is that at least what I have seen is that in many geographies, marine spatial planning is being presented as the solution to all issues affecting the blue economy. And I would say that such statements and such ambitions need to be taken with some care, because there's much more that really affects how we use and how we sustainably use the oceans other than marine planning. I would say for also, and that's what my second point there tries to lift, is the need to relate it to permitting, for example, at sea. That has been a key issue for the development of offshore wind, but also spatial restrictions relative to other uses, operational restrictions for harmonizing with nature objectives, for example. My second point is, as more space is being claimed by exclusive users, such as offshore wind energy or offshore energy, should there be requirements on the coexistence with other users? And this is a hot topic in Northern Europe, where space is becoming scarce, where other interests are already afraid of losing their areas, like fishing, for example, and where some states are actually starting to impose conditions on the offshore renewable energy with regards to ensuring coexistence with some other users. So this is something coming up, and I think will be more and more relevant in more and more geographies. And then there's another issue that also a hot topic, and that is we know far too little yet of the impacts on nature, but also on other users of offshore renewable energies or offshore renewables, especially in the long term. At the same time, governments are committing more and more areas and setting higher and higher targets for renewable energy production. How do we reconcile these? How do we ensure a sustainable governance of the ocean, given these two, or given this large driver, but also the drivers related to environmental protection and ensuring the health of the ocean? And I'll stop here. I'll just put up the 3 points I had at the beginning, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo, for this. Thank you. It's really interesting to note that developers also like input at the beginning phases of the steps for the marine spatial planning. So we have a question for you just to clarify is what is the baseline for starting a marine spatial planning project, especially for offshore wind?
I'm not sure I understand the word baseline in that context. I would say it's the need. Is there a need to? Are there a set of emerging conflicts that need resolving? I tend to think that marine spatial planning that is needs oriented or driven by needs or by a specific need produces better results, and that applies both to offshore wind and to other interests or other issues that affect the ocean. But I'm not sure I'm understanding the word baseline in this context correctly.
So I'm guessing that it's basically like what will drive them to start like a marine spatial planning project. Like what would drive the government to do this?
I would say it is a need. I would say it's probably spatial conflicts. That's if you have emerging spatial conflicts, if you need to organize in a way that benefits society.
Okay.
Then you have, I mean, if I may just briefly, I mean, in the case of Europe, you have many countries producing marine spatial plans because they have to, because there is a EU directive to do so. So the context might also shape why countries do that.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question would be, what would be the potential long-term impacts of offshore wind, and what are like government actors doing to understand these long-term impacts? And if you have an idea what industry actors are also doing to understand these long-term impacts, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I'll leave the answer from the industry to Monica. I do have some ideas, but I think Monica will be a better place to answer that. In terms of long-term impact, that's a very tricky question because the impacts vary very widely between ecosystem components. Unfortunately, I do not know of any country who has robustly followed up impacts for 20-25 years. So it's very difficult to say today what these impacts are. I mean, there's new knowledge coming up the whole time, and there's a whole research now being done on hydrological effects or hydrodynamic effects that we know very little of, and these might be important in the long term and at larger geographical scales as well. Not to say that they will be bigger than any others, but we just don't know. To what are countries doing? I think more or at least some countries are setting up large-scale nationwide monitoring systems.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I would now so it's interesting to hear the side from the public sector, from the government side. So now we'll be making a switch to the private sector, the industry aspect. And for this, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Monica von Disland. She supports renewables projects with consenting environmental impact and environmental risk management as a sustainability advisor in Equinor. She has a strategic environmental affairs and consenting role for offshore wind in Europe. She has worked in the field of impact assessment for over 25 years and was formerly an active member of the International Association for Impact Assessment. Prior to joining Equinor, she got a PhD in strategic environmental assessment from the University of Manchester and worked within planning and academia. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Monica. She will be providing an insight into spatial planning for marine spaces in the offshore energy sector. She will emphasize the importance of a holistic and evidence-based approach that involves stakeholders and encourages dialogue. So her presentation will also focus on the roles that SEAs and marine spatial plannings play in linking and filling the knowledge gaps and ways that industry can use this information like there are generated from SEAs and marine spatial plans. So welcome, Dr. Monica, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. First of all, can I just check you can hear me okay and see my presentation okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, first of all, for inviting Equinor to contribute to this webinar series on such a topical and important topic. I have been asked to give a brief presentation about strategic environmental assessment and marine spatial planning from an industry perspective. So what I will try to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to give some examples of how industry uses the information and the evidence from SEAs and marine spatial plans when we develop projects. Also, how industry can contribute to strategic environmental assessment and marine spatial planning. And then finally, I will try to say a little bit about what role authorities can play in facilitating data sharing from industry. But firstly, just very briefly about Equinor, because I'm conscious that you might not all be familiar with us as a company. We were originally founded in 1972 as the Norwegian state oil company Statoil, and then we changed our name to Equinor in 2018, and we are an international energy company with headquarters in Norway, but we have 22,000 employees in 30 different countries around the world. So we work with oil and gas, we work with renewable energy, and we work with low carbon solutions. But as you heard in the introduction, I work mainly with offshore wind. So I'm afraid also my examples today are largely taken from the offshore wind sector, although a lot of what we're talking about today is relevant for the other energy sectors as well. Equinor supports the global ambition of reversing nature loss by 2030, and we published what we called our biodiversity position 2 years ago. We believe that a well-functioning natural environment is a prerequisite to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You also saw a very nice image of that from Aaron earlier on. And our business decisions, they rest on thorough risk and impact assessments. We see that an integrated ecosystem-based management approach is extremely important, and that is why we're delighted to contribute to this webinar. Now, there are 5 main pillars to our biodiversity commitments, and I will not go into detail of these now, as it is not the main focus of this presentation, but I wanted to show them because, as you see, an increased focus on data sharing and increasing knowledge is one of those pillars, and I'll be talking more about our experiences with data sharing later, and it's also something that you've just heard about also from Gonzalo, so key topic really. So I want to talk about some of the ways in which industry uses the information and evidence from SEA and marine spatial planning. From an industry perspective, a marine spatial plan and the accompanying strategic environmental assessment is evidence that the authorities in that country are taking a holistic and evidence-based approach to the management of their marine space. Now, this is positive for a developer perspective for a number of reasons. It provides a framework for possible development opportunities. And it also gives some predictability in terms of how the authorities envisage the marine space to be used. It also means that there has been some considerations to different sea users and different environmental sensitivities, which helps to reduce the potential for adverse impacts and conflicts of interests for future development opportunities. So, for example, the map on the right-hand side is taken from the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind energy in Scotland, which resulted in the identification of the most sustainable marine areas for the future development of commercial scale offshore wind energy in Scotland, which you can see as the purple areas in that map. And these sites were subsequently put forward for a seabed leasing process in Scotland. So basically through the planning and a strategic environmental assessment, and in that case also sustainability assessment process, these purple areas were the areas that were seen as having the least conflict and the least impacts for developing offshore wind. A spatial plan and its strategic environmental assessment also provides us with an indication of the government objectives. This is also something that Gonzalo just mentioned. It gives an indication of what the government objectives are, what the local ambitions are, what the local priorities are. And that's important to industry if we are to propose development which fits in with government objectives and helps to meet local objectives. The information in the Strategic Environmental Assessment and Marine Spatial Plan is also very useful for informing site selection. Now, I'm using site selection in a little bit of a different way to what was used in the previous slides. I think that was from Arendt. So in this case, I'm using the word site selection for describing which sites we as an industry developer decide to go for in a bid or a license round. So a strategic level plan, a marine spatial plan, will typically identify the key characteristics and constraints and opportunities for the different locations or sites that are identified in that plan. And this not only helps us understand what effects a development in that area may have, but it also tells us something about the consenting risk and the complexity of obtaining development consent or permits for different locations or different sites. So the map you see here, it shows the same areas from the Scottish sectoral marine plan that you saw on the last slide, but here they illustrate that some of those sites are associated with higher levels of ornithological constraint. There are the green areas on this map. And then some of the other areas in yellow here are areas that have been flagged where we need further information before we know what the ornithological constraints are. And then we have the blank or the white areas which have been identified as lower ornithological constraints. So in summary, you can say that the information in the SEA and Marine Spatial Plan, it enables us to make a comparison of the risks and opportunities for the different sites. And it helps industry make informed decisions before pursuing a development opportunity. So once we are at the stage where we have a development opportunity and we start developing our project, the information in the Strategic Environmental Assessment also informs the project level EIA or the ISHA. I will use EIA as a generic term to cover environmental assessment at the project level. The SEA provides information on the key environmental and social issues which need to be considered in the EIA. So it sort of acts as a starting point for the scoping stage in EIA or in the ISHA, where you set out which environmental and social topics are to be covered in the assessment and what the likely significant effects of a development might be. And the SEA also identifies typically the data gaps and the uncertainties, both in terms of the baseline data and the understanding the potential for impacts on the environment. And these may need to be addressed through the EIA. So this is useful information for the EIA. As been previously mentioned, the SEA will typically use the existing information, whereas on the EIA, we typically need to go out and collect the information. The SEA will also typically indicate whether there is a potential for cumulative or in combination effects. And this is important because it's the SEA where you've sort of you're taking a step back and you're looking at the whole plan in a much more high level way than you're able to do in the project level EIA. The SEA might also identify or indicate whether there may be transboundary effects, so effects that are effects in a different state in another country, in which case this is useful to know early on because you may need to plan for transboundary consultation as part of your EIA process. And in addition, the SEA provides a high-level mapping of the relevant stakeholders and also often an understanding of their concerns because there will have been a consultation round on the SEA and the plan. And those comments are often made public. So you get a good feel for stakeholder concerns. And again, this is a useful starting point for your your EIA, sorry, when you need to start reaching out to the relevant stakeholders for their input.
I'm sorry, Monica, just to flag that you have five more minutes to round off.
Thank you. I'll speed up a bit. So that was a little about how industry may use the information in SEAs and spatial plans, but how can industry also contribute? Okay, so one of the key areas we see here is industry can add value by sharing our data. In Equinor, we publish all our impact assessments on our website. These tend to be in their original language only, but we believe it's important both from a transparency and data sharing perspective. And we're also one of the founding members of the UN Ocean Decade Corporate Data Group. This works under the rather wonderful motto, the science we need for the ocean we want. And the Corporate Data Group works to reduce the barriers for sharing data and to create guidance and best practice on how privately held data that can benefit ocean science can be shared. And this initiative has shown that many of the members of this Corporate Data Group have experienced similar barriers to sharing data. They typically include things like the ownership of the data being unclear. Ownership is often split across multiple organizations. There's often limited knowledge of where or how to share the data. The data isn't always in a format that can be easily shared or accessed. And there may be a lack or limited incentives to share the data. And I've also listed a few examples of data sharing platforms here. I don't have time to go into them, but if you do not know already about the Marine Data Exchange, please look into that. Very, very interesting initiative by the UK Crown Estate for the past 10 years, which has included as contractual requirements for offshore wind projects to deliver their survey data to the Crown Estate through the lifetime of the project. So please look into that if you don't know it already. Another way industry can contribute to the SEA and marine spatial plans is through knowledge, and this was also mentioned by one of our previous speakers. I think that was Gonzalo. So as an example, we've been using the world's first floating offshore wind farm, Hywind Scotland, to increase the evidence base on the environmental impacts of floating offshore wind. So we've done various things there, from literature studies to environmental DNA studies, looking at the biomass of fish and potential artificial reef effects, to colonization study, and all of this, also the sound measurement from operational sound from floating offshore wind. All this we make available on our website. And I'm rushing a little bit here, but all the links will be available if you want to look a little bit more. And we're quite lucky in Equinor in the sense that we have our own research department. And the data and knowledge gaps from processes like SCAs and marine spatial plans feed into our research priorities, and they help us determine what to focus on and where additional research can add value. And Gonzalo just mentioned this issue with fishing and coexistence with offshore wind is extremely topical and quite complex, especially for floating wind. So we recently, last year, did a study where we looked into whether certain types of static fishing could be used safely within a floating offshore wind farm. And again, this is published both in terms of the report and this short video on our website. My final slide today is about how authorities can encourage data sharing from industry, because what we've seen is that collaboration between government and industry is crucial for good environmental governance. Equinor comes from a history of sharing data, and we believe in transparency and knowledge building. And our experience shows that setting clear expectations and requirements from the authorities strongly encourages data sharing. And this is also reflected in the guidance and best practice on how to reduce the barriers for data sharing, which the Corporate Data Group is currently working on. And just to briefly sum up there, the input so far from that group is that firstly, what we've already seen in Equinor, that authorities setting clear expectations and requirements strongly supports sharing of data, that planning for sharing of data as part of the whole procurement process in a project makes data sharing a lot easier, and then finally that prioritized wish lists from scientists regarding what types of data they need is very beneficial, rather than the sort of we want all data, which is very challenging task to deliver on. Okay, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that. It's interesting to see you complementing what other speakers had said, and that at Equinor and also in the industry, you guys have like data available for governments and anyone who's willing to use this data for the planning and site selection, and for marine spatial planning as well. So I have a question for you. So what can you tell us what the potential environmental impacts of offshore wind in the project, where the potential environmental impacts of the offshore wind in the project in Scotland?
So if the question was related to our floating offshore wind farm, Hywind Scotland, this is quite a small. Started off really as a pilot. It's the first commercial floating offshore wind farm in the world, but there's only five turbines. So we haven't really identified significant environmental effects, but we're using it very much to try to learn more about the environmental impacts of floating offshore wind. But in general, and that this question was asked a little bit previously, that the thing that's always sort of high on the sort of risk list, I would say, of typical significant impacts. We're always worried about bird collisions, which is why the location is so important, and it's very important to get it right. We're concerned about the coexistence with fisheries, and that's why it's also, again, the location is very important to get it right. And typically marine mammals are also a big consideration in there, for example, in terms of noise during installation, for example. But for actual Hywind Scotland offshore wind farm, I can't really say that we have significant effects because it's such a small wind farm.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we'll be moving to the Q&A session. We've received a couple of questions. So I would kindly ask the other panelists to come on screen. I will be calling the questions out. And just for participants to know, you can download the presentations that you've seen using the handout button on your screen. So first question will go to Gonzalo. The question we have is, how do marine spatial planning processes help reconcile conflicts between spatial users? Like, could you give a specific example on how this helps to reconcile conflicts?
Yeah, well, it basically does so by either by separating users or by setting the conditions for users to coexist in space or in time. What we have seen, I would say, is more an attempt to separate or to find the suitable areas separately. I mean, because again, linking back to what I started off by saying, that offshore wind has been, or exclusive claims of ocean space have been one of the key drivers of MSP. So the attempt to reduce or manage conflicts with activities that are not reconciled
Hi, Gonzalo. Sorry, I think you're frozen. Okay, I think Gonzalo is frozen. I would just skip to another
where
question.
that has been possible.
Hi, Gonzalo, can you hear me?
Yes, I do. I'm experiencing some difficulties with my
Yes.
connection.
Mm.
So I'm not sure how much you heard of what I said.
We almost all. I just heard about how it sets conditions for them to use the places.
Yeah. Basically, my point is the key means of reducing conflicts has been ensuring spatial separation, basically. So keeping users that are incompatible away from one another where that is possible. Fortunately, not always been possible, and in some cases, and that is happening, for example, in the Netherlands now, there are conditions being imposed on offshore wind developers, for example, to make it possible to coexist with other users.
Right. Thank you. I don't know if any of the panelists would want to contribute. Please feel free if you have an additional comment on any of the questions. So I would ask a question to Aaron. Aaron, so one of the participants wants to know, because in many developing countries, SEAs are perceived to be costly and time consuming. And I remember, like, in your presentation, you also highlighted cost. So with limited capacity for data management and institutional coordination, how feasible is it as an instrument for them, for this for people from developing countries or governments?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, we have a very good example because we as an institute are working together with the Marine Institute where Gonzalo is working. And we just had a workshop on Zanzibar supporting Eastern African countries on marine spatial planning. And our most important statement was that integrate SEA and marine spatial planning as much as possible right from the start. Because that is very that is cutting costs and it's beneficial for the process because it benefits from an integrated approach. And especially in many East African countries, there is no tradition yet of marine spatial planning. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to start this process and then integrate SEA right from the start.
Thank you very much. Just a follow-up question to this is, like, what are the key range of expertise and capabilities that are required if you want to constitute a team to carry out SEAs? And this is, Aaron, you can go first, but if Monica, if you want to also contribute, or Gonzalo, please feel free.
Yeah, well, if you remember from my presentation, I identified the key criteria, which is about biodiversity, about, of course, oceanography, to understand the ocean and the currents and the streams, etc. It's about shipping. It's a very important factor. In the Netherlands, sand extraction is also a very important user. So in principle, you need those representatives from the main interests to have them around the table and to start a dialogue based on available data and probably gather additional data. So it depends on the interests that are at stake. But these are the ones that were, let's say, engaged in this SEA prepared for the Netherlands. And then, of course, you need an SEA expert who is able to have an overarching view and has experiencing with these types of multi-sector integrated processes.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I would ask a question to Monica. Monica, you had initially mentioned that Equinor shares its impact assessment data, but do you also share the raw data georeference data so it can be used by governments for its other planning purposes, or is this specifically just impact assessments data?
So we share quite a lot of our data with authorities in different regions. For example, in Norway through the Mariano portal or project, and then through the Marine Data Exchange that I was mentioning in the UK. And another example is that we have we share our cold water coral data from the Norwegian continental shelf. That's also available on our website. Just some examples.
Thank you very much. Also, a follow-up question from the industry perspective is how does industry, or maybe you can use an example from Equinor, how do you manage and address conflicts with other marine users, like maybe fishers or?
Yes, this is a good question, and I think in reality the ocean space is getting so busy that even if you've had a very good spatial plan process and a very good SCA process, you won't necessarily have no conflict, even though you might have hopefully identified the areas with least conflicts. So particularly the fishers, when we're talking about offshore wind, is one of our key stakeholders, and I don't think that we are operating or looking at any country around the world where fishing is not an issue. So what we would always try to have good dialogue. I think dialogue is key. Understanding what their concerns are, understanding what the fishing techniques are, understanding if there's opportunities for coexistence. And there are a few kind of guidance documents about how to work together. But I think that the dialogue and good communications, because at the end of the day, this is why it's so important to have these good processes at a strategic level, so that the areas that are identified as potentially suitable for developing offshore wind in the first place have as low conflicts with other sea users as possible.
Thank you very much. That's actually very important that you dialogue and communicate with relevant stakeholders. A question for Gonzalo is, how is marine spatial planning related to environmental index sensitivity mapping?
I would say that sensitivity mapping would be an input to understanding the planning context in what concerns nature and biodiversity, and the extent to which, or the ways in which, these natural values can be impacted by the activities that you're planning for. That's how we have approached it in the Swedish planning, and that's how I've seen it being approached in other plans as well. So it's part of your, let's call it baseline or background mapping of your planning conditions.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. So a question for any of you, Monica, Gonzalo, or Aaron. Other than providing and supporting baseline data development, how can or how does the industry and government support sustainable oceans planning in countries? Maybe Monica, would you like to go first? How the industry supports, or how can they support sustainable oceans planning in countries?
Yes, this is a good question. One of the things that we are often asked to do is to share our experiences from other contexts. And then we will often be kind of promoting and highlighting the value of strategic planning exercises, like we've been talking about today. It's obviously not something that we can do on our own. I think we would often try to be collaborating with local stakeholders and local universities and research institution, and we also have quite a lot of kind of industry groups where we can try to work together to be trying to improve or to give advice for how we can get good processes.
Thank you, Monica. Gonzalo, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I might just compliment more from the perspective of the state, and let's call it this, the Swedish agency responsible for planning. I would say that our main contribution is basically by doing the planning that abides or that follows a series of sustainability related goals and principles. So by following these goals and principles, we try to produce plans or plan proposals to government that will enable a more sustainable governance of the ocean. I think that's one point. Then on a more, let's call it technical scientific level, I would say we do that also through our assessing and highlighting of the status and the impacts of current and future uses of the ocean. And that's where, for example, SCA of the plan proposals comes in as a key element of making those impacts visible and helping not only government, but society on the whole reach a decision. Okay, what should we do with these resources and these areas that are everyone's? So in a nutshell, I think that could summarize our role in achieving a more sustainable governance.
Thank you very much. Aaron, do you have any contribution? Or
I would like to build upon that. I mean, all UN countries, they are active in all kinds of UN treaties. I already mentioned the UN Treaty on the High Seas. So in those treaties, countries negotiate on standards, norms, and guidance. And that is also very helpful, and it's trickling down towards what is done by the countries and ultimately what is done by the users. So I also would like to emphasize the importance of UN treaties, standards, and guidance.
thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time, so I would like to thank each and every one of you for your contribution, for explaining and taking the time out to come to discuss these issues. But before I hand over to Sadiqa, I would just like to ask: is there just one, maybe in one sentence, one key message that you've gotten out of this discussion? Maybe I'll go first. For me, I would take away that for SEAs to actually support and contribute to sustainable ocean management and planning, you need collaboration. So working with industry and government and stakeholders, understanding needs, setting priorities. So for me, that's my key takeaway. Maybe I'll do ladies first. Monica, do you want to go?
Well, it's like you said, I don't know, key takeaway, I guess it has been interesting that I think the three speakers in this panel, we all have different backgrounds and we've had a different angle, but in a sense, we're all saying the same thing. So I think maybe that would be if there's a key takeaway, that good spatial planning, strategic planning and strategic level assessment is extremely important for steering development in a way that will enable development within in a sustainable way. I think it's the only way.
Thank you very much. Gonzalo, you want to go?
Yeah, maybe I'll take something that Leticia started out by saying, and then Jasmine, you also took up the issue that there are hardly any blueprints on how to go forward and how to address the governance issues, and that's very much the case. And I think when putting up a marine spatial planning process, countries really do need to take that into consideration and think of what are the needs and the priorities of the societies. where this plan or where these plans will be developed. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, for me, in summary, I mean, marine spatial planning and SEA, just do it, because it's very beneficial. And I think, well, some of the institutions around the table are ready to assist and share their experience.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Just wanted to say thank you to UNEP and NORAD for organizing this, and I'll pass it over to Sadiqa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our panelists for such an insightful discussion. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for moderating. And also thank you to our participants for so many questions and, for engaging so much with our sessions. I just wanted to go through some next steps. Please complete your evaluation survey in order to receive your certificate of participation. I will be sending everyone a follow-up email that will have the feedback form. It would also have links to the YouTube channel, as well as a PDF of all the presentations that were shared today. So it will come directly to your emails. Once you've completed your feedback form, you will receive your certificate of participation within 10 days. Now, for some of you, you have attended all 3 of our webinar sessions, so you will also receive an additional certificate of successful completion of UNEP's Global Webinar Series 2023. So thank you so much for participating and engaging. As you have attended the webinar, you will also receive our monthly newsletter updates, and please find the link to our LinkedIn page in the chat. I've just shared it. Keep connected with us and join our community. Once again, this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. We look forward to welcoming you back for our Global Webinar Series 2024. And I just want to say a big thank you to Marisol Estrella, our program coordinator, as well as to Letitia Carvalho and her team for assisting us, and above all, Hadang Zhang, our intern, for all of his work behind the scenes. So thank you so much, Monica, Gonzalo, Aaron, and Jasmine. Yes, and hopefully see you next year.